Welcome to another episode of Self-Help Witch. Self-Help Witch is a podcast and now a YouTube channel for curious creatives to explore paths for deeper self-awareness and holistic alignment. I am your host, Michelle. I'm an astrologer and I love investigating how the magical and material intersect. I believe through digging into these connections, we can build up self-knowledge and systems that help us live our best lives. So that's what I'm here to do, and I hope that you are here for that too, because that's what's happening. So today we are digging into my top 3 insights from a year of formal astrology learning. I just completed a year 1 program with Nightlight Astrology, and it was so much more than I could have ever hoped for. So I'm not just going to hype up my particular program, although I will tell you why I picked my teacher in particular. I just want to say first that this conversation is really for anybody who's interested in learning more about astrology. And I'm talking specifically about going beyond Googling, right? Like going past the keywords and getting into something deeper, the philosophical heart of this symbolic language. And this conversation is also for anybody considering taking an astrology class. I'll share how I arrived at the teacher I ended up going with, and I'll help you with some questions you can ask yourself to decide if taking astrology classes is right for you and how to figure out what kind of teacher might be a good fit. Now, I announced on my stories and on my Instagram in general that this is what I would be talking about this week. And I asked if anybody had any questions about learning astrology, taking classes, etc. And I got some good questions. So we're going to kind of sprinkle those throughout. And let's just start with the first one. So someone asked, what values, lenses, etc. were important for you when looking for a teacher? So this is the perfect question to start the conversation because it really takes us at the beginning. My astrology journey, much like anyone else's, I would imagine, is that I began with independent self-study. I was looking up my chart myself, right? I was researching my own placements. I didn't jump right into buying a course because I really wasn't ready for that. And I think that's where most people are when they start learning about astrology. But you do get to a point where you realize there is more here than maybe what I'm going to be able to find. It's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. And if you find yourself kind of like hitting that wall, then yeah, you probably are ready for a teacher. And I think the question that you or anyone listening would need to ask yourself, the question that I had to ask myself is, what do I want to learn? So when I was first digging into astrology, I found myself really drawn to evolutionary astrology, which I found out too, that there's not just one kind of astrology. There's not just one way to practice astrology. It's so vast and broad. So I was into evolutionary astrology, but I also felt like that perspective wasn't going to give me the philosophical foundation that I was looking for. Because what I was really wanting to know is how the planets, the signs, the houses, how all of the elements of astrology got their symbolism. I wanted to know about the philosophical underpinnings. And evolutionary astrology is a relatively new perspective, and I'm still intrigued by it. And I respect that perspective and the teachers of that perspective. I find very helpful and very articulate and very smart, right? But I didn't want that to be my first class because I didn't think I would get what I was looking for. So I was at that time in some different astrology communities, and one of those was Astrology Hub, which I do recommend if you're starting off your learning. And even if you're not, it's a great way to get exposed to a lot of different kinds of perspectives and philosophies within astrology and kind of get the lay of the land. So I was in Astrology Hub and someone had asked, how do I find out more about the fundamental foundational symbols and how they kind of came to be? And someone recommended Nightlight Astrology. Nightlight Astrology is ran by Achyuta Bhava Das, who's taken an ascetic oath. He's a monk in the Bhakti Yoga tradition. He has been an astrologer for a long time, and he publishes a YouTube, I think every day, or every day of the week at least, or every day of the week days, Monday through Friday. I don't know why that was so hard to get through. But he has a ton of free videos. Mostly they're about the transits and like what's going on right now. But he always does a really great job of like incorporating techniques and really explaining things on such a straightforward, logical level, which is really hard to do when you're talking about abstract, philosophical, spiritual concepts. So, as a teacher myself, I just really vibed with that. I thought that that was really what I was looking for. Someone with a lot of lived experience interpreting the symbols, someone who was really well read, someone who really was a scholar of astrology and taught it from a place of lived experience. That's what I was looking for. And again, the philosophical underpinnings of the symbols. It was a big commitment for me because it's a year and, I have a life, like I have a full-time job and I changed my mind a lot. So I was a little worried. I mean, I was super into astrology, so I wasn't too worried, but still a year's a long time. And I am so grateful that I did it because it was so much more than I ever could have hoped for. I got so much rich, deep philosophical scaffolding that I would not have had without this course. And as somebody who wanted to not only learn astrology for themselves, but to use this skill to support other people, I feel like it was invaluable for me to take this class. So if you're considering taking a class, I would recommend Nightlight Astrology if you're into all the things I was just talking about. But maybe you're not ready for that level of detail, right? Because not everybody is. I don't think that's for everybody. Another approach might be to think about, like, again, what do I want to learn about? So if you're really interested in moon signs, I guarantee there's an astrologer out there teaching a class just on moon signs, right? So put your feelers out once you kind of know what you're interested in diving into first. And then make sure you kind of like vet whoever you find, right? Because sales pages, they work for a reason. I think sometimes we hear the right verbiage and we like jump on board with the teacher before we really know if that's what we want. So see if they have a blog, see if they have a YouTube, see if you vibe with them, because you're not going to want to learn from somebody that you don't like. And then once you've kind of done that research, you'll know what to do. So that's my advice if anybody's interested in learning about astrology and taking a class. But I don't think it's for everybody. You can definitely self-study and get a lot out of it. So my top 3 insights from this year of astrology courses are that you are not your birth chart, the symbolism of the Thema Mundi, and that astrology is a divination practice, not a science. So let's start with you are not your birth chart. This seems like a riddle, right? Because we come to astrology to learn more about ourselves and gain deeper self-awareness. So what the hell? Yes, true. But that is not the same as the chart telling you who you are. There is a difference. And the difference is, where does the power lie? Let's just think for a moment, what gives the chart its power, if we can call it that? How does the chart, quote unquote, know anything about us? Is it the symbols in the chart, or is it the person interpreting them? So let's think about it like this. In order for a chart to have any kind of meaning at all, there needs to be someone who can interpret it. And there needs to be someone who is receptive to its messages. That implies that the symbols don't speak for themselves. There is a necessity of an interpreter and a receiver of the symbols for them to have any significance. So if you're the one interpreting your chart, you are both the interpreter and the receiver of the information. You might be Googling, what does Scorpio in the 7th house mean? But you are the one reading the description. You are the one feeling the pings when you hear or read something that really resonates in the description of that placement, right? So you are the one making meaning of it, and therefore you are the one bringing the chart to life. So because the chart can't speak for itself, what's actually happening when we're reading a chart is we're co-creating the meaning of the chart with the universe. And that's a take that maybe not every astrologer or astrology advocate would agree with, but I'm going to say more on that later. So I'm just going to kind of put a pin in that and we'll get back to that. But I'm going to say for now that because your consciousness and receptivity is involved in the interpretation of a chart, then it's impossible for it to tell you who you are because you have to exist first, right? So let's think about it like this. Astrology is a spiritual language. It's a symbolic, archetypal, spiritual language. And when we think about like the question, who am I? Oftentimes we forget that that question is about right now because who we are is always changing. It's always evolving. We're always growing or not growing. But even when we're not growing, we are changing, right? Humans don't stay static unless they die. So when you say like, who am I to a chart, it's going to reveal to you whatever you need to know right now. Because the symbols in the chart, once again, are archetypal. I keep saying that. But what I mean by that is you can't pin them down. They are multivalent, multidimensional. And when you try to box it in, you're going to miss the mark. You're not going to actually get the meaning. And our charts are always revealing themselves, right? They change. And well, the chart itself doesn't change, of course, but the symbols and the way they present themselves do. The chart is giving us the karmic context of our lives. It's not telling us, hey, you like chicken, not steak, or you should major in communications. Now, your chart can give you an idea of what you're good at or what you might be driven to do, but it's not going to get so granular as to, what's the job that's going to help me make the most money. The chart has no connection to our culture or the time that we live in or anything like that, right? And it's also not interested in those kinds of questions because, once again, this is a spiritual language. I guess what I'm trying to get home here is that it's studying your birth chart. It's not some spiritual hack to living your best life. Can it help you get to know yourself on a spiritual level? Absolutely. And I think that's really what we mean when we say astrology for self-awareness. It's really astrology for spiritual awareness. This takes us to our next question, which is, if I'm not my birth chart, then how can I learn about myself with astrology? And I hope that I basically just answered that question. It's a good one. It's worth asking. But the reason you are able to use your chart to engage in self-study is because the chart reflects the karmic context of your life. It will help you understand the themes, situations, people, and energies that you'll encounter in life and the path that your spirit is on. It will help you recognize your inherent strengths. It will give you fodder for reflection that will help you get to know yourself. So it's not so much a blueprint as it is a mirror in my mind. I know people liken the chart to an energetic blueprint, and I don't completely disagree with that. I do think the idea of a map kind of implies that there's like an A to B, or there's like a code you can crack to like self actualize. And I don't think that's true because that's not really a thing we can do, in my opinion. Like self actualization is a goal that can never really be reached, I think. But suffice it to say, the chart reflects back to you whatever you need to see. That changes throughout our lives. So, when I first started studying my chart, I was really interested in my Saturn Neptune conjunction. And that makes sense because Pluto was transiting my fourth house where that is. And it was making contact with Saturn and Neptune in my chart. And yeah, that was a really fucking rough time if you're curious. I talked about that on my solar return episode a few episodes ago. But all of this to say, the chart is a mirror that reflects back to you what you need to see in that moment. And it's not like a step by step to self actualization. It can help you learn about yourself, but you have to be a willing participant. It's not just going to like hand you over the information on the silver platter. It will give you stuff to work with. And then from there, you make the meaning of it and you become a more aware human. Now, this takes us to our second most powerful insight of the year, which is the concept of the Thema Mundi. So I absolutely could not do this justice in one podcast episode, let alone 10 minutes. I've also only been studying this for, about a year. So there's more to learn about it. But I want to introduce the concept to you because it really helped me with what I told you I was interested in learning in at the beginning, which was the symbolism. So the Thema Mundi is the birth chart of the universe, which is so fucking cool, right? It was actually a teaching tool in ancient times because it contains the symbolism of the foundational concepts of astrology. So the first thing I want to tell you about this is that the planets mostly are following the Chaldean order. If you're familiar with planetary days or planetary hours, those use the Chaldean order as well. The Chaldean order is the Mesopotamian order of the planets based on how fast they go. So it's the same all the time. It goes the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. However, it's not exactly following that order in the Thema Mundi. In this chart, we've got the moon in the first house, then the sun is out of order. The sun comes next in the second house in Leo. Then we have Mercury in the third, Venus in the fourth, Mars in the fifth, Jupiter in the sixth, and Saturn in the seventh. So everything is in the Chaldean order with the exception of the sun, which seems like, well, what's up with that? But it actually works because the two lights are in the first and second house. The sun and the moon are in the first and second houses, with Cancer on the ascendant in the first house and then Leo in the second. Okay. Thing number one. Thing number two is when we go around the wheel from the moon clockwise and then from the sun counterclockwise, we get the Chaldean order. So the first house on either side of the sun or the moon is going to be a Mercury ruled sign. And then the next one will be a Venus ruled sign, and then a Mars ruled sign, and then a Jupiter ruled sign, and then a Saturn ruled sign. This is important because it's going to set up and establish some really important foundational truths of astrology. One of those that I found really helpful is the idea of planetary contrarieties. And that's really just a fancy way of saying like that two planets are opposites on the same spectrum. It helps to understand them more deeply, and it also helps to understand the signs they rule more deeply. So we'll start with the sun and the moon. Both the sun and the moon oppose Saturn rule signs. So why does that matter? Why is that relevant? Well, the sun and the moon, again, are the two luminaries. They're the lights in the sky. And Saturn was said to represent darkness. And of course, that's not just literal darkness, it's metaphorical darkness, endings, limitations, separation. And of course, Saturn was affiliated with death, right? Kronos, Ida's son. So we've got the lights that are life-giving opposing the planet that represents death and darkness. So of course, we can see how those are two opposites on the same spectrum. Then we move to Mercury opposing Jupiter ruled sign. So Mercury and Jupiter are a planetary contrariety. This makes a lot of sense as well because Jupiter is the unifier. It sees the big picture and it's able to put everything together in a cohesive way. It creates cohesion. Whereas Mercury disseminates, disintegrates, and analyzes. It wants to pick things apart. We see how these are two sides of the same coin as well, or the ends of the same spectrum, because we need both to make a plan. We need to be able to see the details, but we also need to be able to put it all together into a cohesive, unified whole. And then the last pair that we have is Venus and Mars. So I think it's pretty obvious how Venus and Mars are opposites in a lot of ways, but Venus is all about desire and pleasure, and Mars is about aggression and fighting and passion too. So I think about the phrase, without effort, there can be no grace. That feels very much like an embodiment of the contrary of Venus and Mars. So that concept really helped me understand the planets on a deeper level, as well as the signs they rule. So we've got our last question now, which is by far the deepest question and also the question that I've had for the longest. Someone asked me this question a few months ago, and it was so deep that I had to really give it time and find the right way to respond to it. So the question is, what is the relationship between the planets and how their energy plays out in our lives? Why do we look to them? So this question gets back at what we were talking about in the beginning of this talk, which is, where does a chart's power come from? Can I blame being chronically late on my Pisces stellium? Does astrology imply our fate is predetermined? These are really big questions that I think a lot of astrologers are kind of afraid of because they don't really know how to answer them. And I will definitely put myself in that camp prior to coming to this course, prior to receiving this question even. And one of the things that helped me get to the heart of this and really give me a framework for understanding how and why astrology works is this book, The Moment of Astrology. So Geoffrey Cornelius wrote this book. He's an astrologer based in the UK. He's written essays. He's very fucking smart. And he's got this really compelling argument that astrology is a divination practice, not a science. And when we try to pigeonhole astrology into this idea of science that we have, that we've developed over time, we are doing astrology a disservice. We are kind of cutting it off at the root, and we're not going to get what we want out of it anymore. So the moment of astrology is a justification of astrology through directly addressing its criticisms. Cornelius takes us through history, how astrology in Mesopotamia, it was a way to divine. It was a way to interpret the omens that were present in the sky. And the ancient people really thought that they were communicating or interpreting the language of the gods. As we move into the Hellenistic era, it becomes a little bit different. It becomes about being the best predictor. And And then when we have the fall of the Hellenistic era and we have the rise of Christianity, there is obviously a doing away with of all things pagan, quote unquote, all things that don't align with the Christian worldview. Um, don't align with the patriarchal worldview, I'll say, because I don't want to talk badly about Christianity. There were a lot of Christian mystics at this time, right? And they were not welcome either. It's really just a downward slope as far as the reputation of astrology goes between the end of the Hellenistic era to where we are now. Not just because of the rise of patriarchy and the rise of Christianity, but also the Enlightenment, also people attacking astrology and trying to undercut it based on the fact that it's not scientific. So Cornelius argues that this idea of science became something called scientism, what he calls scientism, which is basically like if you can't prove it with tangible evidence, then it's not real. And what that does is it discredits intuition as a valid way of knowing something. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you know how problematic that is. That's probably something you were kind of reworking in your own life. I know that's something I've had to do myself. And Cornelius is saying, look, we've got to stop trying to do that because astrology has always been about divination. It's always been inherently spiritual, and we are not going to be able to prove it with tangible evidence. And why is that? Well, because astrology is actually about synchronicities. So Carl Jung describes synchronicity or defines it as an acausal connecting principle. So this kind of takes us to the idea of like, what do the planets really do? Is there some kind of physical phenomenon happening where the planets are physically interacting with my life? And the answer is no, there's not. And that's not what astrology is trying to say. That's the pitfall of trying to classify it as a science. It's really not saying that at all. There is some kind of connection between what the planets are doing and what's happening in the material world, but it's acausal, meaning we can't link it to a cause and effect. Jung said about astrology, any results occurring in astrology are due to the non-rational breakthrough of archetypes at certain moments, pure synchronicity. So once again, in other words, we're not going to be able to prove it with science. And there is an inherently spiritual element to astrology. I love this quote from Cornelius in his essay that I read in preparation for this episode. I'll link in the show notes. He says, is astrology a divination practice and therefore dependent on imaginative creation rather than objective facts that are established in nature? If so, should it be considered subjective? In other words, are the understandings I get through astrology actually my own subjective creations? I think a lot of us are averse to that idea because it seems like we are saying astrology is just something I'm making up. It's something I'm just intuiting, and we invalidate that. Why? Because throughout history, intuition has not been seen. It's been pounded out of us that this is a valid way of knowing. And the reality is with astrology, when we're interpreting a chart, we are divining. We are going to the oracle, basically, which is the chart, and we're asking a question. And then the interpreter of the oracle is providing the information through their lens. And when they do that, when that information goes through that lens, there is something happening. And Cornelius refers to this as like psychic creativity. It's this synchronicity, this acausal connecting principle. Something is happening, and it's definitely spiritual. It's definitely intuitive, and it's definitely unseen. And that's not to say that like technical knowledge isn't helpful, because it is. There is definitely validity and good reason to study astrology formally and to learn the techniques. And there are many technical aspects to it. In the same breath, a good astrologer is not just going to read keywords to you. They will have a connection to the oracle. And that connection comes from having a spiritual life. So astrology is not a science. It's a spiritual language. And we shouldn't try to pigeonhole it as this like physical phenomenon, because that's just not what it is. So those are my top 3 insights, y'all. I hope you enjoyed it. Please DM me if you have any questions or if you want to go deeper on any of these topics. I'm happy to offer resources. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or on my new YouTube channel. Also follow me on Instagram at selfhelpwitch. I love you. Keep going. Goodbye.